Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of our webinar series. This month, for the month of April, we're going to be doing a special edition for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and we're going to be talking about what to do after a sexual assault. So just some housekeeping things like we typically do. I'd just like to warn you that some of the content you're about to hear might be upsetting, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause the playback if you need to. And also, we'd like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory. And these are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So let's take a little bit of a look at where we're going to be going for today's presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about Sexual Assault Awareness Month, what it is, where it came from, that kind of thing. We're going to move on to what sexual assault is, going to talk a little bit about consent as well. And then we're going to be going into some crisis medical services, what that might look like, where you can go for those, some crisis social services, again, what those might look like and where you can find them. We're going to be talking about interacting with the justice system and what that process looks like as well. And at the end, we're going to answer some frequently asked questions about sexual assault, about accessing services, and then, of course, our contact information will also be on the last page. Okay, so Sexual Assault Awareness Month happens every year during the month of April. Last year, we also did a special webinar edition for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. That one is available on our YouTube page if you'd like to go back and watch that. Teal is the Sexual Assault Awareness Month color, so that's why you might be noticing a change in our usual color palette, and why I'm wearing teal in this video. Sexual Assault Awareness Month really began in the 1970s when second wave feminism, or so-called second wave feminism, was at its peak. And it was really just a grassroots initiative started by a group of activists for women's rights with the intent to raise awareness around sexual assault, work to prevent future instances of sexual assault, and to recognize survivors of sexual assault. So really, Sexual Assault Awareness Month has been observed for almost 50 years at this point. Women's organizations and grassroots groups hold events throughout the month of April, marches, rallies, fundraisers, and now with the advent of social media, a lot of groups and organizations are using that to get information and resources out to the public and raise awareness around sexual assault. So what is sexual assault? And if you've been watching a few of these webinars, you might notice that I define sexual assault quite a lot. And the reason for that is it's been found that when asked, many members of the general public cannot define what sexual assault is. So I feel like every time we talk about it, it's important to define it just one more time and kind of really make sure that people know what it is and what it isn't so that there's no confusion. So sexual assault is any sexual activity, behavior, contact, or touching that makes you uncomfortable and or that you did not consent to. So being pressured, manipulated, coerced, or threatened into engaging in unwanted sexual activity or contact, being unable to give consent to the sexual activity because you were asleep or unconscious, intoxicated, or using substances. It can include things like forced kissing or fondling, or forced oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse. So sexual assault really centers on the notion of consent. So it's inextricably linked to sexual assault, but unfortunately it's not talked about as much as it should be. And in terms of sexual assault, consent means voluntary and ongoing agreement through words and or actions to engage in a particular sexual activity. So consent can be revoked at any time to stop the sexual activity. Consent for one sexual activity is not consent for all sexual activities. So it needs to be given on an ongoing basis with respect to the particular act. Consent that's given once doesn't mean that it's given to the same person every time in the future. So this is something that's particularly pertinent in the context of relationships. So just because you consented to sex with your partner on one occasion or a particular act with your partner on one occasion does not mean that that consent stands throughout the rest of the relationship. It needs to be given every time sexual activity takes place or every time the sexual activity changes. It's important to note also that if an individual is under the age of 16, they cannot give consent. That's the legal age of consent here in Canada. Also, you can't give consent if you're intoxicated, under the influence of any substance, passed out, sleeping, or if you've been coerced, pressured, or manipulated or threatened in any way. So it has to be each person's individual consciously made choice. Consent is also not given if an individual's in a place of authority or has power over you in any way. So, for example, a teacher or a clergy member, coach, family member, once that power dynamic is present, that disparity in power, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for true consent to be given, because once that power dynamic is in place, that opens the possibility for coercion, pressure, manipulation, and really, if somebody doesn't have the option to say no, then the yes doesn't count. So that's something that we see in situations of disparities in power, and it's really important to remember that as well. And also, consent is not given when basic needs such as housing or food are offered in return for sex. So that's not to say that voluntary sex work is not legitimate. It is, but when it's given in place of basic needs, consent rather, when consent is given in return for basic needs such as housing or food. Again, that opens up that power dynamic where one person has the power to provide these basic needs for another person based on the provision of consent. So we want to make sure at all times that consent is given continuously, that we know that it can be taken back at any time, and that we know that consent for one sexual activity is not consent for all sexual activities. So let's talk a little bit about crisis medical services that you can access if sexual assault has taken place. And this is also good information to have, not just for survivors of sexual assault, but just for anybody, because you never know when you might meet somebody who has experienced a sexual assault, or you might be put in a situation where somebody is asking for help. So many survivors choose actually to present for medical care first post-assault. Some do not, but I just like to note that it's always a good idea to get checked out medically if you've experienced a sexual assault, even if you don't have any visible injuries. You just want to make sure that you're checking for things like STIs, that you're checking for things like pregnancy, internal injuries, injuries that you might not have noticed, that kind of thing. And of course, always call 911 if you're in need of emergency assistance. And it's also best for someone to present to a medical professional as soon as they are able to, especially if they're wanting to get a forensic kit done, because the sooner you go, the easier it is to collect the best forensic evidence. And also, it's best to present as soon as you're able, just so you're able to get the care you need as quickly as possible. Emergency department staff can conduct a medical assessment, collect forensic evidence, and administer care. And this is the case for Brandon Regional Health Center. We don't have a sexual assault nurse examiner program in Brandon as they do in Winnipeg, but emergency department staff can take a forensic kit nonetheless. Outside of Brandon, if you want to present to emergency departments in other rural areas, they can also conduct the medical assessments and administer care. However, they may not be able to collect forensic evidence in smaller emergency departments. For those that travel to Winnipeg, as that is something that happens quite a lot, is survivors of sexual assault in rural areas will travel to the biggest urban center, which is Winnipeg. Winnipeg offers a sexual assault nurse examiner program, which offers specialized sexual assault care. They're trained in trauma-informed care. It's a separate area of the emergency department that's not able to be accessed by the general public. They can provide referrals to other social services. They can assess eligibility for the traumatic brain injury program, which is something that's relatively new, but is a really important development in providing care for survivors of sexual assault, because it's not the case that we really think about traumatic brain injuries when we think about sexual assault. We're starting to do that now, but when somebody has experienced sexual assault, they may have hit their head, they may have experienced facial injuries or other kinds of head trauma, they may have experienced strangulation or loss of consciousness, and those things can severely impact the brain and can cause pretty severe injuries. Concussions, that kind of thing. So it's important that there are staff that are trained to assess eligibility for traumatic brain injuries and be able to make referrals for the proper care. So the concussion program is run through Klinic in Winnipeg. So unfortunately, Brandon does not have a concussion program that they're able to refer to. And there are 4 criteria for eligibility for the concussion clinic for traumatic brain injuries. First is youth or adults diagnosed who sustain head trauma that's directly caused by intimate partner violence, including those with head injury, concussion, or structural injury. So for example, hemorrhage or skull fracture, or injury secondary to strangulation. And I just like to note that while it says intimate partner violence, the sexual assault nurse examiners can also refer to the eligibility for Pan Am's concussion clinic. So I just wanted to be clear about that. The second criteria is a clinical presentation to Health Science Center emergency department within 10 days of the date of the injury. Again, Brandon does not have the ability to refer to this program just yet from the emergency department, but presentation to Health Science Center emergency department in Winnipeg will be able to make that referral. The third criteria is an initial medical assessment performed by HSC emergency department. And the fourth criteria is residence within Manitoba. So this is a Manitoba only program. Referrals to Pan Am's concussion clinic can come from emergency physicians at HSC or from the sexual assault nurse examiner program staff. And this is because there's quite an overlap in cases of sexual assault and domestic violence cases. So like I noted before, even though it only mentions intimate partner violence in the criteria for the eligibility, there's such an overlap between sexual assault and domestic violence that referrals can come from the same program as well. So when deciding whether or not to present to a medical setting, for example, HSC, and deciding whether or not to ask for that concussion clinic assessment, you might want to, there are some symptoms of TBI, traumatic brain injury, that you might want to look out for, one being dizziness, headache, neck pain, blurred vision. That's all going to depend on the individual. Everybody experiences head injuries differently, but those are some of the more common ones. So after they've been referred to the Pan Am concussion clinic, patients are going to be assessed by a traumatic brain injury specialist. They'll receive follow-up care and be connected to other services as needed. So it really is a wraparound program, and it's a really important development for sexual assault survivors in this province. So crisis social services, Manitoba has quite a number of social services available in Winnipeg and in Western Manitoba. The sexual assault crisis line is available province-wide, and it's got a toll-free number that I've listed there. It's run by Klinic Community Health in Winnipeg, but again, it's available province-wide. Anybody can call in. They can help you with finding resources close to home. It might be a good option for those seeking assistance more than 72 hours post-assault. Because again, after that length of time, it becomes difficult to collect forensic evidence. It's still possible to be treated for medical injuries, of course, and to make a report to the police or to do a third-party report. but it's something that operates 24/7 as well. So that's an option that's always available. There's also West Van Crisis Services, and there are toll-free numbers listed as well. They can assist those specifically in Western Manitoba who are experiencing a mental health crisis, and a mental health crisis, of course, may come from sexual assault. They also offer a mobile crisis unit and a crisis stabilization unit. They can connect you with those services if that's what's needed. There's also 7th Street Health Access in Brandon with their address and phone number there. They provide non-emergency care. So again, if you're experiencing an emergency or if you're presenting to a medical setting directly post-assault, the Brandon Regional Health Center is probably your best bet. But again, if it's more than 72 hours post-assault, 7th Street Health Access might be an option. They have a nurse practitioner on staff to provide that non-emergency healthcare. So, for example, pregnancy tests, screening for STIs, treatment of minor non-emergent injuries. 7th Street also has community social workers who can provide short and long-term counseling and referrals to other social services. There's a cultural facilitator if translation is needed. There's also access to shower, telephone, washer, dryer, all that kind of stuff as well. And of course, us at the Women's Resource Center, I've put our address and phone number there as well. We offer drop-in counseling and referrals, advocacy services that can connect you to other programs that can help you apply for certain programs, determine your eligibility for certain things, help you navigate systems, all of that kind of stuff. We can also accompany people to the police station, to the hospital, to their court dates for that extra level of support. We also have staff that are trained in third-party reporting and in completing protection orders, and we offer wellness programming as well on a drop-in basis. So let's talk about interacting with the justice system post-sexual assault, because this can be something that is not only really traumatic for folks, but something that is also filled with a lot of unknowns. The justice system can seem like a very daunting thing, and the process of going through it can seem very daunting. So it's important to reiterate just right off the bat that the decision whether or not to report directly to the police is a personal choice. We know that it's uncomfortable for people or inaccessible to report directly to the police for a number of reasons. And it's important to note that you don't have to if you don't want to, but that is a choice that is completely up to you. If someone does decide to report a sexual assault, it might be helpful to have a counselor or advocate with them to offer support through the process, to kind of help them navigate the system, to just provide general support, to let them know, to advocate for their rights. And that's something that we offer as a service, and we have staff that are trained and well-versed in doing that. So when interacting with the justice system, specifically the police, as that's usually the first step, they'll take a statement. And when providing a statement to the police about the assault, the interview will likely be recorded either by a video or audio. Again, you can have a support person in the room with you when you're doing that. They can't participate in any way, but they can be there just as a supportive presence. It's important to tell the police everything you can, even if it doesn't seem important. It might be helpful for tracking patterns of crime, trying to link perpetrators from one crime to another, and identifying trends in crime. The police will also collect evidence such as clothing and other physical evidence, a doctor's report. They may be present at the medical forensic examination, and they will likely take photos of the injuries as well. So it's important to understand what your rights are when you're making a police report. It's not just a police-driven system. You have agency as well. So when making a police report, you have the right to be treated with courtesy and compassion and respect. You have the right to ask the officer taking your statement that they be of the same gender as you. However, it's important to note that in smaller communities, this might not be possible. So you have the right to ask it, but it might not always be feasible for them to follow through on that. You have the right to privacy. So while it's important to share as much information as possible, you still have the right to your privacy. You have the right to ask the officer for clarity or to explain why they're asking certain questions, and they have to answer those questions. You have the right to take a break at any time, as of course, making a statement can be extremely overwhelming. So you have the right to take a break at any time. You have the right to ask for an interpreter if your first language isn't English or French, and that will be provided. You have the right to transportation assistance if you have a physical disability or mobility issue. You have the right to be accompanied by a volunteer advocate, as I mentioned. Also, just to reiterate again, they're not allowed to participate in any way in the taking of the statement. They're not allowed to contribute, but they are allowed to be physically in the room, providing that supportive presence, which can be really helpful for a lot of folks. You have the right to end your statement at any time, to opt to not continue with it, and you have the right to review the statement that you gave before it's formally submitted. So after you've made the police report, you should get a card which provides with an incident number as well as the police officer's name and badge number. And these things are important to keep because it helps you to access information about your file. And also for accessing victim services supports, you'll need the incident number to do that. So if the police or Crown Attorney read your statement and believe that there is enough evidence, they may lay charges against the person who assaulted you. But it's also important to note that if charges are not laid, which is unfortunately the case in a lot of sexual assault cases, it's not necessarily because the police or the Crown don't believe you or they don't believe that the assault happened. It may just be because there is not enough evidence to proceed with the criminal charges in court, or there is not a reasonable likelihood of conviction of the accused. However, if there is enough evidence to prove that a crime has been committed, the person who assaulted you will be arrested and charged with the pertinent crimes. It's also important to note, and I'm sure a lot of people already know this, but the legal process can take a long time. So it's important to form a safety plan in the meantime, to have the support of an advocate or some kind of guidance. And that's something that we provide in our services as well. We can help folks to form a safety plan and determine how best to keep them safe as they continue in this process, and also to provide support to help them navigate the system as it can be overwhelming. As I mentioned a little while ago, many are uncomfortable with reporting directly to the police, understandably so. So a third-party report might be a good option for them. However, I'd also like to note that the third-party report does not replace a formal police report. So charges can't be laid based on a third-party report. It's not going to go to the Crown. It's a way to get your story on paper, to have a record of it. And a third-party report can be used in the filing of a formal police report later on, if that's what you decide to do. So to get a third-party report started, you can report to a community-based agency, such as the Women's Resource Center, who can then report to the police on your behalf through the third-party reporting mechanism. The John Howard Society is the only other third-party reporting agency in Brandon, other than us, so that's important to note as well. The community-based agency, so for example, us, we will not reveal your identifying information to the police without your consent. This process is entirely survivor-driven. It's based entirely on the choices that each individual person makes that they decide are the best for their circumstance. So we're not going to give them your name, we're not going to give them your birthday, we're not going to give them your address or your phone number, so they will not be able to contact you directly. This will limit their ability to take action. However, they will use the data in the third-party report to kind of determine patterns of assaults in the community, to identify potential offenders. But again, they won't be able to lay charges based on the third-party report. However, anonymity can't be guaranteed in all situations. So for example, if a child under the age of 16 is involved, or in situations where others may be in direct danger, then the third-party reporting agency would be obligated to provide the personal information of the person making the third-party report. If the police are going through the third-party report and they have questions or want clarification on something in the report, They can't contact the survivors directly because, again, they don't have that personal information in the majority of cases. So what they'll do is they'll contact the community-based agency, who will then contact the survivor and be the kind of middle person going between the police and the survivor to get the questions answered and all of the information placed in the report. So to end off, let's go through some frequently asked questions about sexual assault. Just to try and highlight how important it is that we keep talking about sexual assault. We keep presenting the important information and resources so that people understand sexual assault a little bit better. So one question we get a lot is, how common is sexual assault? And unfortunately, due to a number of factors like how personal sexual assault is, how traumatic it is for a lot of folks, and how intense the social stigma is on sexual assault, we don't know for sure how many people experience sexual assault. Again, because the vast majority of folks don't report to the police, and police reports are what statistics are based off of. However, research and analysis has been able to estimate that approximately 1 in 3 women over the age of 15 have been sexually assaulted. Sexual assault is, again, notoriously underreported, so it's suspected that that number may in reality be higher than 1 in 3. So another thing we get asked a lot is, what's a normal response to sexual assault? And there's no such thing as normal when it comes to sexual assault. Whatever a person's response is a normal response. There's a whole host of reactions to traumatic events such as sexual assault that can be considered normal. However, there are some commonalities in the things people experience who have experienced a sexual assault. So that they might experience anger, confusion, or frustration, difficulty completing everyday tasks or returning to their life as they knew it, anxiety or depression, isolation, altering of daily routines. And additionally, the impact sexual assault has may differ greatly because of several factors, like the nature and duration of the assault itself, the physical harm that was incurred, whether or not the perpetrator was known to the survivor and how they knew each other. The potential presence of abuse or neglect or assault earlier in life can affect that as well. How family, friends, and community members react to the assault. So really everybody experiences sexual assault differently, and there's no one normal response to it. There's also no abnormal way to react to a sexual assault. Everybody's different and reacts differently to traumatic situations or events. What's important to remember is that you're not alone, and of course it's not your fault. And the Women's Resource Center is always available to help you in any way that we can. So what are the long-term impacts of sexual assault? So similar to the initial responses, the long-term impacts can vary from person to person based on circumstance, based on prior history, and just based on the way that they process emotions. The ways that each person processes trauma can be very different as well. So some of the more common possible long-term impacts can include prolonged anxiety and depression, feelings of shame. It can affect people's sleep. So they might be either sleeping too little or too much compared to what's normal for them. They may experience isolation or inability to recollect some or all of the event or to put it in chronological order. It may impact their personal relationships. They could feel fear and anger. They may engage in substance use, or they may experience prolonged physical pain. So all of this information is drawn from our sexual assault brochure, as well as our sexual assault resource guide. Those items are available in the center. Paper copies are available in the center. So if you'd like paper copies of the sexual assault brochure or the resource guide, please feel free to contact us using the information below. I would also note that the sexual assault resource guide and pamphlet are currently undergoing updates. So the ones that are available will be replaced probably by the end of the month with an updated version, just so everybody's aware there will be a new version coming out with the most up-to-date information. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next month.